Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us, by the way, at Twitter, twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. Of Persian descent, Fouad Ajami was raised in Lebanon, coming to the United States at the age of 18. A senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Dr. Ajami is professor of Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University. His most recent book is entitled The Foreigner's Gift: The Americans, the Arabs, and the Iraqis in Iraq. Fouad Ajami, welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having me.
Segment 1, Iraq. Have we won? Vice President Joseph Biden this past February, quote, hold on to your chair for this one, I am very optimistic about Iraq. I mean, this could be one of the great achievements of this, Barack Obama's, of this administration, close quote. So, what do you make of that?
Luckily, there are no paternity tests to be given to the Biden claim that he is that this is a victory for the Obama administration. I actually knew Vice President Biden, then Senator Biden. I haven't seen him since his rise
since his elevation.
Exactly. We used to take the Acela Express, the metro liner. I came from New York. He came from Wilmington. I've known then Senator Biden, and his position was remarkable. He basically said there is no Iraq. He said there were three countries in Iraq. There was Shi'istan for the Shia,
right,
Sunnistan, and Kurdistan. This was the general proposition.
That was Peter Galbraith is the
yes.
one who made that thesis, that we should just break it up into three separate countries.
Yes, Peter Galbraith, who wrote a book called The End of Iraq, that Iraq was over. Luckily, the fact that we'll take Vice President Biden joining us in the Iraq caravan. I think the Iraq project has worked out well. I know Iraq very well. I spent 5-6 years coming in and out of Iraq. I know the Iraqi politicians to a man. I know the American commanders. I know the American soldiers. We can be proud of what we've done in Iraq. We have midwife. America has midwife a binational state that means Arab and Kurd, and has midwife a democratic entity in the heart of the Middle East.
Two quotations, Fouad. The first, President George W. Bush, February 2003, quote, a new regime in Iraq would serve as a dramatic and inspiring example of freedom for other nations in the region, close quote. The second is you, Fouad Ajami, March of 2010, this very spring, quote, peace has not settled upon Baghdad, but this new Iraq, even in its current condition, is a rebuke to the dynasties and the dictatorships of the Arab world, close quote. Now, what interests me there is that Bush said a new Iraq could be an inspiring example, which would suggest that the surrounding Arab nations would want to move toward the new Iraqi model.
Right.
And Fouad Ajami says something a little bit different. It's a rebuke, which suggests that they will simply hunker down in a kind of simmering resentment.
Right. I'm honored you paired me with a man who happens to be a hero of mine, that's President Bush. He was very kind to me. He himself awarded me the National Humanities Medal, so that gives you a tender feeling for the president. I saw him often and talked with him about Iraq often. I think history would be immensely kind to what he did in Iraq. I think the truth is there is a Mexican standoff, if you will, between Iraq and the autocracies of the region. The autocracies of the region tried to destroy this nascent Iraqi democracy. They sent jihadists, they had their media, Al Jazeera television, Al Arabiya television. They had the entire intellectual class in the Arab world against Iraq.
Okay,
but
stop
Iraq
there.
succeeded.
You talked about autocracies plural.
Right.
So you're not talking about just Iran.
No.
Are you suggesting Egypt?
Oh, definitely. I'm suggesting
the Saudis were trying?
Absolutely. There is the threat, if you will, the countries in the region that were menaced by the example of Iraq. It was in part a Sunni Shiaism, we can talk about that.
Right.
But the Jordanians and the Egyptians and the Saudis were hell-bent on making sure that this Iraqi project does not work. Think of the lead terrorist who came to Iraq and sowed death and destruction in Iraq was a man named Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. American forces killed Zarqawi in the summer of 2006. Zarqawi is from the town of Zarqa in Jordan, east of Amman. The Egyptians, the Saudis, we have documents that 40% of the jihadists who came to Iraq to kill Shia and to kill American soldiers were Saudis. 20 or so % were Libyans. So by and large,
And your contention is that the House of Saud has enough intelligence in its own. They knew what was going on. They looked the other way.
I mean, they looked the other way because anyway, the House of Saud didn't like this Iraqi experiment. It was secular, it was democratic, it was Shia, and don't forget, it was going to be a rival in oil production. So there were many, many reasons, economic as well as philosophical, as well as who's going to be America's base, favorite base in the region. Is it going to be Saudi Arabia, or will this new Iraq be a competitor for America's attention? So the Saudis knew what was going on.
All right. So now give me your analysis of the current mind of Barack Obama. He ran against the war in Iraq, and now he has his vice president saying, "Oh, this is one of our great achievements."
Well, I think Barack Obama, remember, his war isn't Iraq. His war is Afghanistan. Because in the discussion leading up, if you will, to the election, Barack Obama made the case that there are stupid wars and smart wars.
Right.
There are wars of necessity and wars of choice. So he claimed the Afghanistan war as his kind of war, that this is the war he would fight. This was the war of necessity, and this was the good war. And he branded Iraq as a war of choice and a bad war. And indeed, in his trip to Cairo for the famous speech he gave on June 4, he maligned Iraq before other Arabs. He maligned the Iraq war. But now he's glad to have it because it is working, it's a success.
Segment 2, Afghanistan. Two different events. Last December, President Obama decided to commit an additional 30,000 troops to Afghanistan, bringing the total American force to about 100,000. Item 1. Item 2, this past spring, President Karzai of Afghanistan gave a speech that amounted to a diatribe against the United States. Karzai spoke of, quote, countries like Afghanistan, where there are more than 100,000 foreign troops, they, meaning foreigners, pursue their own interests. A very thin curtain, quoting the president of Afghanistan, a very thin curtain distinguishes between cooperation and assistance with the invasion, close quote. Karzai went on to warn that he too might join a campaign of, quote, national resistance, close quote. What is going on?
There you go, Peter. Don't go to the Hindu Kush mountains for gratitude. This is, this is the lesson. Hamid Karzai is a bandit chieftain. That's the tradition he comes from. And there is something...
He's a bandit chieftain, and you say that in the nicest possible way.
I mean, he's just a bandit.
All
and
right.
Hamid Karzai, as we know, basically, and the cat was let out of the bag by our ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Kabul, General Eikenberry, who happens to be both an ambassador and a former commander in Afghanistan. He said that Hamid Karzai and his people have no interest in the U.S. leaving Afghanistan. They want the U.S. stuck on the scene. They want the money of the U.S., they want the support of the U.S., and then...
And Eikenberry's ambassador, former general, said this in a memorandum which somehow ended up in the New York Times.
Absolutely.
All right.
There is, as we know...
And that's correct. His assessment was correct.
His assessment was completely on the mark. And the dark message of his assessment, the Afghan campaign can't be won. That the Afghans really have no interest in the U.S. leaving their country. And he said of Karzai, he has no interest in assuming burden of governing Afghanistan. And so comes this Hamid Karzai going rogue on us, if you will. That's the description. Borrowing the title of Sarah Palin's book, I said, we have an ally in Kabul who's going rogue on us. And this is the dilemma of America in Afghanistan.
So that in running against the war in Iraq and saying that was the unnecessary war, but saying Afghanistan is the necessary war,
right.
Barack Obama chose the harder of the two, in a certain sense. Iraq is a real country,
Sure.
Some tens of millions of people,
Absolutely.
with a real capital city, a history of trade and commerce, oil reserves. The elite had an interest, commercial interest, historical interest, in reviving their nation. And in Afghanistan, it isn't really a nation. Is that what your argument?
Well, that's exactly my argument, and you put it better than I've been able to put it. It's fine.
I
I'll
doubt that very much.
borrow your words. I always describe Afghanistan as the revenge of the Iraq War. We trashed the Iraq War, and then, therefore, President Obama claimed that Afghanistan is the good war. So we now have this good war of necessity going very badly. And in my opinion, there's nothing to be gained in Afghanistan. We say that Afghanistan is a central front in the war on terror. But look what's happening today. It's whack-a-mole. We say it's Afghanistan, but it turns out Yemen is now more important
Right.
than Afghanistan. So, look, I was a hawk on the Iraq war. and I didn't question the Iraq war. I haven't really written much about Afghanistan by way of criticism. I've written something analytical, but I have dark thoughts about Afghanistan and whether Afghanistan is worth American blood and American treasure.
Well, I didn't expect you to be quite that grim about. So was the commitment of 30,000 additional a mistake?
Look, I'm the proud uncle of 2 captains in the U.S. Army, and
Congratulations.
One of them, thank you. And one of them is in, maybe one of them is in special forces. I mean, these boys will end up there, as many of their colleagues whom I knew while they were at the military academy. This is a very big commitment for our country and a very serious commitment. And I honestly don't know how it ends. Because Afghanistan...
You can't even see a way in which it should end.
It just doesn't
You can't see a way of putting the pieces together.
It just doesn't end well. I'll give you an example. Take Hamid Karzai, Dapper Don, the Dapper Hamid in Kabul. Hamid Karzai is a Pashtun by ethnicity.
Yes. Which is about 60% of the population.
Well, actually, in all these countries, numbers are tricky because everyone claims they're whatever. But I think the trouble with Afghanistan is there is no majority. Because even the Pashtuns are a plurality.
I see.
But this regime in Kabul right now is really basically, in the view of the Pashtuns, it's a Tajik regime. And they view Hamid Karzai as the cat's paw of a Tajik regime. So our dilemma as an outside power, we came into Afghanistan from the north. We bonded with the Northern Alliance. And the Northern Alliance was Tajiks and Uzbeks and Hazara. While the Pashtuns, who believe that Afghanistan is theirs, in fact, they feel very alienated from the American effort, and they feel very alienated from one of their own, which is Hamid Karzai. And that's why Karzai made these statements about the U.S. It was to curry favor with his own Pashtun community, which feels that he is a traitor to the cause.
Okay, so I'm the layman here. Let me try to here's what I think I understand so far. Correct me. In Iraq, you have a country, which is a country for at least 80 years, and then those 3 regions have a history together that goes back through the centuries of the caliphate and various.
Right.
All right, so you actually have a region, an elite, a trading tradition. It's fine. So when we go in and engage in nation building with reluctance and but we engage in nation building, there's a nation to rebuild. In Afghanistan, there's no nation to rebuild. On the contrary, what you have is a very concrete, specific, and historically grounded tradition of tribal warlords, regions, constantly seeing things. So it's not even as if we have a clean slate. We'd almost do better trying to build a nation in the Sahara. At least we'd be starting from zero.
Absolutely.
Now the notion is we have to overturn a tradition of centuries standing. So this is pretty close to crazy.
Right, I think you have it absolutely right. Look, Iraq is a river society. And it's a river. I mean, there is the Tigris and the Euphrates.
Right.
And there is a civilization which was always centralized. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Sumerians, the Abbasids, the British hegemony, then the independent Iraq. And think of the Iraqi government as a big ATM machine. There's oil money, and everybody wants this oil money. And then
holds them together, if nothing else.
Yes, if you're the prime minister of Iraq, you're a rich man, and people want your favors. And you can centralize power. Like take even Kurdistan, which is supposed to be autonomous. It's autonomous, to be sure, but 17% of the central treasury goes to Kurdistan, and the Kurds have a vested interest in a united Iraq, and everyone else has a vested interest in a united Iraq. Afghanistan is very different.
Give me then one, I'm asking for an impossibility here, but we're under the constraints of limited time. One sentence, 2 sentences of advice to President Obama about Afghanistan.
Well, I don't think President Obama should make Afghanistan the so-called central front on the war on terror, because in the bazaar, that just increases the price of the Afghan real estate. It gives the Afghans a sense they could blackmail us, that we're so dependent on their largesse and so dependent on their hospitality. We must tell the Afghans unequivocally that we have other concerns in this war on terror, that Afghanistan is not the central front on the war on terror.
All right. Segment 3, Fouad, Iran.
Sure.
Let me quote you. The theocracy in Iran was said to be waiting on an American opening, and President Obama would put an end to 3 decades of estrangement between the United States and Iran. But in truth, Iran never wanted an opening to the United States. Close quote. Why not?
You have cut to the heart of what I've been saying about Iran for a long time. I'm grateful to you for, it's interesting that you found that argument. Because here's the thing, for 8 years, particularly under George W. Bush, the left beat up on President Bush by saying, if you only extend an olive branch to the Iranians, if you only don't include the Iranians in the axis of evil, see, the Iranians are desperate for an accommodation with the United States. My view was always that the Iranians had no interest in any accommodation with the United States. They can survive the sanctions we've imposed on them because they can turn to the Italians, the Japanese, the Chinese, and others. And in fact, they never wanted an accommodation with the United States. And as soon as Barack Hussein Obama came into office, he genuinely believed that because his middle name is Hussein and because the patron saint of Iranian Shiism is Hussein, that he can make a deal with the Iranians. The Iranians wanted no deal of any kind.
Fouad, let me give you another quotation. The question I have is, what do they want? How are we to understand this regime? Let me quote you again. There are Iranians yearning for liberty, but we should not underestimate the power and the determination of those moved by the yearning for piety.
Right.
Close quote.
I'm about to say I give up because, in fact, you've, again, found these passages which to me go to the heart of this debate about Iran. I'm worried about people who believe that Twitter and Facebook and so on will overthrow the Iranian regime. I have many, many Iranian friends. I respect their desire to see their country overthrow this tyranny, this theocracy. My worry is it can't be done that easily. My worry is that a regime which is invested in the lower middle class, a regime which has these besieged millions of volunteers, they're vigilantes, a regime which is anchored in the Revolutionary Guard, which is the most radical element in Iranian society, and a regime which is a petrocracy. It's petroleum and autocracy. It's a petrocracy, a regime which has oil money, that with this oil money, the supreme leader can violate and can defy the laws of gravity in Iran, and he could actually keep his regime going. It won't be easy to see the end of this regime in Iran.
All right. In Iraq, you've got an elite that understands the trading, commercial tradition, understands it sitting on top of oil, wants to hold the country together if for no other reason than commercial purposes. In Afghanistan, if I'm understanding you correctly, the best brief description of the right way to think about it is warlords.
Right.
They want to defend their own villages. They want the honor of their family and their tribe.
Right.
And they want to make money and do deals. Fine. In Iran, what is it? Do they want regional dominance?
Yeah.
Do they want a Shia caliphate?
Right.
What do they want?
Well, actually, the Shia part of the Iranian thrust for power is really minimized because the Iranians are hell-bent on showing other Muslims, meaning majority Muslims, meaning Sunni Muslims, that they're not a sectarian regime. It's no mystery for what the Iranian theocrats want. They want dominion over Persia itself, over their own land, over their own power, over their own oil money, and they have that. They have pretty much, in fact, imposed their will on the society. And then
the Persians are only 65% or so of the population, so they have a lot of minority groups.
Absolutely, but the dominance of the Persian element is very strong. So I think in the case of the Iranians, you now have to think of Iran as a power also of the Mediterranean, that thanks to the money they have invested in both Hezbollah in Lebanon and in the Hamas movement in Gaza, Iran has become a substantial and powerful member all the way to the Mediterranean. So the program continues. The Iranians have an idea of themselves as a large, big, important nation, and they have an idea of the rights to acquire nuclear weapons, and they have an idea of their ability to awe and dominate the region around them, the Persian Gulf. And I think that the program is on.
Testifying before Congress in April, the director of this month as we tape, the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Ronald Burgess, was asked how long it would be before Iran could produce enough highly enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon. General Burgess replied, quote, "We're talking 1 year," close quote. Should the United States tolerate a nuclear Iran? And if not, what can it do?
Well, you know, I'm not the weapons. I don't know much about nuclear technology and nuclear affairs, but it would seem we now even have the authority of none other than Defense Secretary Bob Gates saying we can't really do much about Iran's quest of nuclear power or nuclear capability. Now, there is a trick here.
But wait, how do you read that memorandum from Gates that was leaked a couple of weeks ago in which he says we need to develop fallback positions? Is the Secretary of Defense saying as an analytical matter there's very little we can do? Or is the Secretary of Defense reading his commander-in-chief and saying, in effect, since you're not willing to go in and prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons, we need to consider fallback positions?
I think it's the former. I worry.
You do?
Yes.
Right.
I think Defense Secretary Gates is very interesting. He was always close to this big Brzezinski. That always worries me about him. And in fact, I think there is already sort of smuggling into the debate on Iran that we should now think about Iran after the bomb.
Already?
Yes. And anyway, there is something of a distinction between, like Iran could have the fuel, the design, the detonator, and it could, without getting into the so-called breakout phase, becoming a real nuclear power, it could be a virtual nuclear state without triggering the idea and the reality that it is now armed with nuclear weapons. I think it's a very dangerous business, and I think the options are not pretty. We either take it to the Iranians and try to stop their nuclear program and tolerate the collateral damage, if you will, the side effect, terrorism, radicalism, and the like. They will fight us in Afghanistan. We are close to them. They will make the life of our soldiers in Iraq more difficult. They have Hezbollah in Lebanon. They can strike at the Israelis through the Lebanese.
They have plenty of ways of fighting back.
They have plenty of ways of fighting back, but I agree with what then candidate Senator John McCain said. He said, hitting Iraq is bad, but there's one thing worse than hitting Iran, than attacking Iran, which is allowing Iran to become a nuclear power.
All right. Segment 4, Israel. Sure. From an open letter to President Obama, published in April by Ronald Lauder,
sure.
President of the World Jewish Congress. Quote, this is a letter that appeared in newspapers all over the web. Mr. President, he says to Barack Obama, Jews around the world today are concerned about the dramatic deterioration of diplomatic relations between the United States and Israel. The Israeli housing bureaucracy made a poorly timed announcement. This is when Joe Biden was in Israel, and your administration branded it as an insult. Our concern grows to alarm as we consider some disturbing questions. Why does the thrust of the administration's Middle East rhetoric seem to blame Israel for the lack of movement on peace talks? Close quote. Are you willing to stipulate that he's correct, that under this administration there's been a deterioration in diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Israel?
I think, look, Ron Lauder is very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's always been close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So all the commentary on this open letter to President Obama proceeds from the right conclusion, that obviously this letter was cleared with Prime Minister Netanyahu. There is no way that Lauder would have taken that letter public had Prime Minister Netanyahu said this is a bad idea.
Right.
I think things are not good between the U.S. and Israel in the presidency of Barack Obama.
All right.
I think it almost harks back. There was a period of time when Bush Sr., Bush 41, entered into a test of wills with then Prime Minister Ishaq Shamir, and it went badly for Ishaq Shamir. We are now in a bad season, in a hard season in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel.
More from Ronald Lauder's open letter to President Obama. What are America's strategic ambitions in the broader Middle East? The administration's desire to improve relations with the Muslim world is well known, but is friction with Israel part of this new strategy?
Right.
Is it assumed that worsening relations with Israel can improve relations with Muslims? Rough up the Israelis and things will get better with the Muslim world. Do you think, is that what the administration is thinking?
I don't know about this. It's also, if they are thinking, it's a bad strategy. Because you don't ditch your ally in order to make an appeal to someone else. Because in fact, one thing about the greater Middle East is people have a real interest. They have a real scent for a foreign power. What's a foreign power up to? What is it made of? I like a quotation that was made by the late Pakistani dictator Zia al-Haq, when he once said, look, being an ally of the United States is like sitting on the bank of a great river. The ground is lush and fertile, but every 4 to 8 years the river changes course and you find yourself sitting in a barren desert. People worry whether we are really, in fact, friends for the long haul, for the tough period of time. What's clear? There is philosophically and temperamentally a divide between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu government. And what's also clear...
Over what? What's the substance?
Well, I think the Obama administration is convinced that you need to put forward a peace process in motion. And that if the Palestinians don't want to negotiate with Israel, you should have something like proximity talks. Don't bring the Palestinians to direct negotiations with Israel. Let's do it through American auspices. And if President Obama is also there are entreaties to him saying you should have your own peace plan. If the Israelis and the Palestinians can't offer their own blueprint for peace, there should be an Obama blueprint for peace. Israel has never liked that, because that, by definition, will put Israel at odds with the United States. And that's really the diplomatic dance in this.
One last quotation from Ron Lauder's letter. Shouldn't the United States remain focused on the single biggest threat that confronts the world today, and that threat is a nuclear-armed Iran?
Sure.
So, you and I have
Right.
talked about Secretary of Defense Gates and the memo that was leaked in which he says, let's consider effectively, how do we handle a nuclear Iran? So if you're Benjamin Netanyahu and you are charged with the defense of the state of Israel,
Absolutely.
are you not thinking, it would seem to me entirely plausible to suppose that the cabinet is meeting 2 and 3 times a week and getting the latest intelligence from Mossad, and they're trying to decide if they have to go, if their duty to their nation requires them to go in and see if they can set back the Iranian nuclear program. Is that plausible?
I would think it's part of the job requirement of being an Israeli prime minister is to think about what Iran is doing every day, because that's your constitutional oath of office. You have to protect the citizens of the state of Israel. And the Israelis can't be complacent about Ahmadinejad talking about eliminating Israel, denying the Holocaust.
Stop there. How do we understand that? Is he serious?
Is
he crazy? Well, how do we understand a man like that?
He's both a true believer and a deranged man. And the combination is not impossible. He's a true believer. That's what he believes. And remember, he comes from the Revolutionary Guard, this most radical element of the Iranian regime. And I think that he's not the most powerful man, by the way, in Iran. I mean, Iran isn't about Ahmadinejad, but nevertheless, he is the faithful son, so to speak, spiritually and philosophically, of the supreme leader. He is a deranged man and a dangerous man.
Fouad, is it correct to suppose, then, that over some period of months, as the question of nuclear weapons in Iran plays itself out, the fate, if not of the world, then of the region, rests on decisions, on information being acquired by a tiny organization called the Mossad, and decisions being made in the cabinet room, and there are a few thousand, possibly only a few hundred people involved in making decisions every day, the import of which is so significant that what happens in Afghanistan could pale by comparison. Is that right?
No,
is this what's going on?
You're absolutely right. Look, Iran is hell-bent on acquiring nuclear power. They say power, but they really mean weapons. They're not going to acquire nuclear technology and leave it at that. There are 2 men in the world, and only 2 men in the world, who can prevent this. One of them is President Obama, and the other one is Prime Minister Netanyahu. So either President Obama or Prime Minister Netanyahu puts a halt to this Iranian drive, or the Iranians will have what they want. What they've been after.
All right. Segment 5, the nature of the threat. We just had Mark Stein here.
Sure.
So let me test out the thesis. In America alone, Mark Stein presents the startling demographic argument, which is fundamentally that Western populations in Europe are shrinking, Muslim populations are expanding, and there's a kind of vacuum. Muslims are moving into Europe. So, and furthermore, and now this is the bit I'd like you to evaluate. I'm going to quote Mark. There are moderate Muslims, but no moderate Islam. All of the official schools of Islamic jurisprudence commend Sharia and jihad.
Right.
So a moderate Muslim is moderate to the extent that he's a little relaxed about the practice of his own faith.
Yes. I don't agree with Mark Stein.
You don't?
No. I was born a Muslim. I was born to a Muslim secular family. I was born to a Muslim secular Shia family in Lebanon. My family were modernist. They interpreted the faith in a moderate way. None of the women in our family were ever, veiled. It was a modern interpretation of Islam. They thought of themselves as good Muslims, and they didn't want these radical Islamists telling them how to worship and how to practice their own kind of Islam. But people who say that there is no moderate Islam trouble me, because I know that the battle for Islam is not yet lost. And if I may say here, be a slight propagandist for this project we are doing at Hoover on Islamism. And
the Hoover Institution
absolutely,
at Stanford, right?
We're doing this project called the Herb and Jane Dwight Working Group on Islamism and the International Order. And we have a series of good working papers. We have books a couple of them have already come out, more to come. We don't believe the battle for Islam is lost. We believe it's an open battle. We know that the Islamists, the radical Islamists, are trying to hijack the faith and weaponize Islam, so to speak, to use that term. But I can't go that far and say there is no moderate Islam. I know, for example, there are many jurists in the Islamic world who are keen to get Islam back from the radicals. I know there are even Saudi jurists in the heart of Saudi Arabia who now understand that the drift toward radicalism is now a menace to the kingdom. And I know that the king of Saudi Arabia, to whom these religious scholars really in the end answer, he's already drawn the line that we can't just say we have to declare jihad against infidels and so on. We can't say that the mixing of the genders in school is wrong. So I think it's too bleak, right, the way Mark Stein would put it. It's not my view.
Let me give you a little more bleak Stein here. Mark writes, quote, that there are only, quote, 3 possible resolutions to the present struggle, close quote. And he just clicks through them. Sure. One is that the West could submit to Islam, and that means the end of Western civilization.
Okay.
That's out. 2, we could destroy Islam, just be cold-blooded about it, but, quoting Mark, the slaughter would change America beyond recognition, close quote, and to put it mildly. Sure. 3, reform Islam, but, quote, ultimately only Muslims can reform Islam. All the free world can do is create conditions that increase the likelihood of Muslim reform, close quote, including a democratic Iraq, making progress in Afghanistan, and so forth. All right, so series of questions around that. And the first, of course, is, do you agree with that fundamental analysis? Those are the 3 choices. That seems right, doesn't it?
Right. I mean, there I could walk with him through the Aleppo Bazaar, if you will, with Mark. We can't destroy Islam. Islam is 1.5 billion people,
right,
all the way from Indonesia in the east to Morocco in the west. It's 1/4 of mankind. Islam is vast and varied. It's one form of Islam in Indonesia, quite another form of Islam in Pakistan, quite another form of Islam in Iraq. For example, I had the honor of interviewing in Iraq and getting to meet and see Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, the most revered Shia jurist in the entire Shia world. You come to his home, it's separated from the street by a piece of batik, a very modest home where this greatest of jurists with enormous power over the believers in Iran and Iraq just is sitting on a cushion on the floor with a fan overhead and a modest place and a belief in democracy and a belief in the human rights of Iraqis and a dread, like when you see him, when you talk to him, a dread of anything radical, bombers, radicals, jihadists. He loathes all this. So, there's all kinds of Islam. Now, where Mark Stein is right, the battle for Islamic reform is a Muslim battle. What we can do is we can help, if you will, nudge the Islamic world in the right direction. We can...
Well, what's a nudge? What's a nudge?
Well, we nudge them in Iraq. We created the conditions in Iraq.
All right, so a nudge can be quite a big, difficult, bloody thing.
Right. Indeed, we nudge them with the diplomacy of freedom of George W. Bush, which Barack Obama abandoned. President George W. Bush talked about the reform of Egypt and Saudi Arabia and was very forthright about it.
Fouad Ajami on Barack Obama's speeches in foreign capitals, quote, while the Europeans and Muslim crowds hailed him, they damned his country all the same. Mm-hmm. For his part, Mr. Obama played along, and in Ankara, Cairo, Paris, and Berlin, he offered penance aplenty for American ways. So on the one hand, we have a president who's doubled down in Afghanistan.
Sure.
over the opposition of his own supporters. He sends in an additional 30,000 troops. And on the other hand, we have a man who apologizes for the United States.
Right.
We have him for a minimum of another 2.5 years.
Right.
And possibly, if he wins a second term, 6.5 more
Absolutely.
years. How is he going to... What can we expect from him?
Well, look, Barack Obama is the one who increased the drone strikes in Pakistan and then has this kumbaya foreign policy, let's all love each other and let's do multilateralism. He's a very good politician. He's a very interesting man. He's not the caricature that, the people who don't like him, they have to understand that your name can't be Barack Hussein Obama and be elected president of the United States without enormous talent. He's got talent aplenty. Here's what he's done. And I think in that he was poorly advised. He doesn't understand this Arabic expression, which I will offer our audience. My brother and I against my cousin and I against a stranger. There's one thing Arabs and Muslims don't like, which is someone who comes into their midst and trashes his own. President Obama walked into Cairo and spoke poorly of the Iraq war and apologized for America. It was a terrible mistake. And even the people at the receiving end, they may enjoy his taunts of President Bush and his attacks of the Iraq war, but you are never respected. If you break with your own, you break with your own.
Fouad Ajami, author of The Foreigner's Gift, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson. Thank you for joining us.